A little girl vanished from a sidewalk in broad daylight in under 10 minutes in a town where nothing bad ever happened, and 27 years later, a dusty envelope in an attic will reveal that the monster who took her had been standing behind a chain-link fence, watching her play, weeks before he ever laid a hand on her. What her older sister found inside, that envelope didn't just reopen a cold case. It shattered a family's understanding of the last 3 decades, and it sent one woman driving north alone toward a house she was never supposed to find. This is the story of Lily Miller, and by the end of it, you will understand exactly why some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how many years pass, no matter how carefully they're hidden, no matter how perfect a lie appears from the outside. Let's go back to where it started. Because to understand how impossible this disappearance seemed, you first have to understand the town it happened in. Oakage, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1984, was the kind of place city people imagined when they pictured the perfect American suburb. Except Oakage wasn't imagining it. It was living it. The houses sat in tidy rows, painted in soft, sun-faded pastels. Their front lawns clipped close and even, their porches decorated with pumpkins and cornstalks every October like clockwork. Massive oak trees, the ones that gave the town its name, lined every sidewalk, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy that turned gold and copper and rust red as the season changed. It was a kind of street where you could stand at one end and see clear to the other, where every driveway held a familiar car, and every dog barking in the distance belonged to a family you could name without thinking. People in Oakage left their doors unlocked, not because they were careless, but because they had never once been given a reason not to. Children rode their bicycles up and down the cul-de-sacs until the streetlights flickered on at dusk. That was a signal, universally understood by every kid in town, that dinner was waiting and it was time to come home. Neighbors borrowed sugar from each other. Neighbors watched each other's kids without being asked. It was a town built on quiet, unspoken trust, the kind of trust that takes generations to build and, as it turned out, only minutes to destroy. In the middle of all that comfort and predictability lived the Miller family. Thomas Miller ran the hardware store at the center town, the kind of establishment where he knew every customer by name and could tell you exactly which aisle held the exact size of nail you needed without looking it up. He was a steady man, unhurried, with callous hands and a gentle voice, the sort of father who never raised his voice because he never needed to. His wife, Martha, worked behind the counter at the community bank, and she ran their household with the same careful precision she used to balance a ledger, warm, organized, endlessly devoted to her 2 daughters. The older of those daughters was Sarah, 12 years old, serious beyond her years, fiercely protective in a particular way only an older sibling can be. And then there was Lily. Lily Miller was 7 years old, and she was, by every account anyone in that town would ever give you, pure sunlight given a body and a laugh. She noticed everything. A strange beetle crawling along the sidewalk crack, an oddly shaped cloud, a leaf that had turned 3 different colors at once. She'd stop mid-stride to study these things, completely unbothered by the world moving around her, and then she'd press her favorite leaves into the pages of her notebook like tiny, fragile treasures. She had a gap-toothed smile that could light up an entire room, a wild mess of brown curls that never quite stayed in place no matter how many times her mother brushed them down, and a small, delicate birthmark just below her left collarbone, a tiny crescent moon, pale against her skin. Martha called her little star mark, and she made a ritual of kissing it every single night before bed, right before she turned off the lamp. Sarah and Lily were close in a way that only sisters with a 5-year age gap can be. Protective, playful, inseparable despite the distance in their ages. Because both of their parents worked until 5 in the evening. The responsibility of watching over Lily after school had fallen to Sarah, and it was a job she carried out with quiet pride for months. It had become a rhythm so practiced it barely required thought. Sarah's middle school let out at 2:45. That gave her just enough time to walk the few blocks to the corner of Elm Street and Maple Drive, where she'd sit on a low stone wall and wait, sometimes swinging her legs, sometimes reading, until the heavy yellow bus groaned to a stop with familiar squeal of brakes. Then the 2 of them would walk the remaining 3 blocks home together, past the Henderson house, where old Mr. Henderson could always be found puttering among his prized rose bushes, past the tiny neighborhood park with its single wooden swing set, and finally down their own quiet cul-de-sac, where the only traffic worth mentioning was a neighbor's car pulling into a driveway after work. 10 minutes, maybe less. A walk they had made together hundreds of times without so much as a scraped knee. But Tuesday, October 14th, 1984, would not be one of those ordinary days. And nobody in that house eating breakfast that morning had any idea how permanently their lives were about to be split into a before and an after. The morning began the way most mornings did in the Miller household. A little chaotic, a little rushed, entirely unremarkable. Thomas sat with his coffee, scanning the local paper. Martha moved briskly around the kitchen, assembling lunches with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Sarah was hunched over a math worksheet she'd forgotten to finish the night before, pencil scratching furiously. And Lily sat at the table humming some half-remembered tune from music class, swinging her feet, utterly unbothered by the low hum of urgency around her. She was wearing her favorite yellow raincoat that morning. It wasn't raining. The sky outside was just a flat, heavy gray, threatening without delivering, but Lily insisted on wearing it anyway, because she loved the way the bright color popped against the dull autumn backdrop. Martha packed a sandwich, an apple, and a single chocolate chip cookie into Lily's red plastic lunchbox, the same one Lily carried every day, and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead before handing it over. "Have a good day, sweetie," Martha said, smoothing down an unruly curl that refused to behave. "I will, Mommy," Lily answered, already swinging the lunchbox back and forth by its handle, already thinking about recess, about her friends, about anything except what was coming. It was right before they walked out the door that Sarah mentioned the detail that would end up rewriting everything. "Mom, I have a science project meeting after school today," she said, pulling her jacket on. "It's going to take about an hour. I won't be able to meet Lily at the bus stop at 3:15. Martha paused. She glanced at her watch, running through the logistics in her head the way she ran through account numbers at the bank. Quickly, methodically, searching for a solution. The bus schedule couldn't change. Neither she nor Thomas could leave work early. It was the middle of the week, and the bank was slammed. And really, when she thought about it, what was the actual risk? It was 3 blocks. The same 3 blocks they'd lived beside for a decade. Every single neighbor along that route knew Lily by name. Mr. Henderson was always outside with his roses. Mrs. Gable practically lived on her porch. It was broad daylight in a town where nothing bad had ever happened. Not once. Not in living memory. "All right," Martha said finally, crouching slightly to look her youngest daughter in the eye. "Lily, listen carefully. Sarah has to stay late at school today. When the bus drops you off at the corner, I need you to walk straight home, just like we practiced. Do you understand me?" Lily's eyes went wide with a particular thrill of being trusted with something grown-up. "I know the way, Mommy. It's just past the swing set." "Exactly," Martha said, smiling despite the small knot of unease tightening in her chest. "You walk straight home. You don't stop to talk to anyone. You don't go to the park. Straight to the front door. You use your key, and you lock it behind you the second you're inside. Then you wait for Sarah. She'll be home by 4. "Okay," Lily said, practically bouncing with the novelty of the responsibility. Sarah looked at her little sister and felt a small, fleeting stab of guilt she wouldn't fully understand until years later. "I'll be home as fast as I can," she promised. "Just go straight inside and watch cartoons until I get there." It was a simple plan, a reasonable plan, the kind of plan made every single day, in every single town across the country, by parents who trust their neighborhoods because their neighborhoods have never given them a reason not to. Nobody in that kitchen could have known that those 3 blocks of familiar sidewalk were about to become the site of the worst thing that would ever happen to their family. Nobody could have known that the bright yellow raincoat, the one Lily wore simply because she liked how it looked against the gray sky, would become the last thing anyone who loved her would ever see her wearing. The school day passed the way school days do. Bells ringing, lessons droning, the ordinary rhythm of children moving from one hour into the next with no sense that anything was different about this particular Tuesday. At 3 o'clock, the elementary school let out in its usual explosion of noise and movement, hundreds of kids pouring through the doors toward the waiting line of yellow buses. According to Mrs. Higgins, the kind, older woman who drove Lily's route, everything happened exactly as it always did. Lily climbed aboard, took her usual seat in the 3rd row on the right, and spent the ride quietly watching the trees blur past a window. At 3:15 sharp, the bus rolled to its familiar stop at the corner of Elm and Maple, brakes hissing, doors swinging open. 3 children stepped off that afternoon. 2 brothers who lived right on the corner bolted immediately for their own driveway and disappeared inside. And then there was Lily's small, bright yellow raincoat catching what little light the gray sky offered, red lunchbox gripped tightly in her right hand, turning in the direction of home just like she'd been told. Mrs. Higgins watched her take those first steps. Then the doors closed, the engine rumbled, and the bus pulled away to continue its route. That was the last confirmed sighting of 7-year-old Lily Miller. At 3:45, Sarah finished her science project meeting and hurried out of the middle school library. Backpack heavy against her shoulders, the autumn air noticeably colder than it had been that morning. The sky had darkened into a deep, bruised gray, and a sharp wind had picked up, scraping dry leaves across the sidewalk in brittle, rattling gusts. She wasn't worried, not yet. She pictured Lily curled up on the couch, cartoons flickering, cookie crumbs already scattered across her chin. She reached the house right at 4 o'clock. The yard was empty. The house was quiet, too quiet. She reached for the door handle and found it locked, which wasn't unusual in itself. Their mother had told Lily to lock it behind her. Sarah dug her key from her backpack, twisted it in the lock, and stepped inside. Silence. The television was off. The lights were off, leaving the living room drowned in the flat gray light, filtering through the windows. "Lily?" Sarah called out. Her voice echoed slightly in the still house. "Nothing." "Lily, I'm home." She tried again, moving into the kitchen. Empty, untouched since breakfast. She checked her parents' bedroom. Empty. The bathroom. Empty. And then the room she shared with her sister, where the bed sat perfectly made, the toys arranged neatly in their usual corner, and no 7-year-old girl anywhere in sight. A cold, unfamiliar feeling began to crawl up from the pit of Sarah's stomach. Not panic, not yet, just confusion, sharp and disorienting. She checked the backyard next, calling Lily's name into the wind, watching it get swallowed up by the empty yard and the tall, silent fence. Nothing. She went back inside and picked up the kitchen phone, dialing the number for the bank with fingers that had gone strangely stiff. "Bank of Oakage, this is Martha." Her mother's voice answered, light and unbothered. "Mom, it's Sarah." She fought to keep her own voice steady. "Is Lily with you?" There was a pause, a long, heavy pause that told Sarah everything before her mother even spoke. "What do you mean, is she with me? She's supposed to be home." "Sarah, I told her to go straight home." "She's not here, Mom. I got home 10 minutes ago. The door was locked. She's not in the house. She's not in the backyard. I've looked everywhere." "Did you check next door?" "Maybe she went to see the neighbor's dog." "You told her not to stop anywhere." "I know I did." Martha's breath hitched audibly through the phone line. "Listen to me. Go outside. Walk back toward the bus stop. Maybe she got distracted by something. I'm telling my manager I have to leave. I'm calling your father. Go look for her." The line went dead. Sarah's heart had begun to hammer now, a rhythm that felt entirely disconnected from her own body. None of this made sense. Lily didn't wander off. She was an obedient kid, thrilled at the responsibility she'd been given that very morning. She wouldn't just disappear. Sarah grabbed her jacket and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked behind her without a second thought, and began retracing the exact route her sister was supposed to have walked. The first block passed in a blur of quiet houses and empty driveways, her eyes scanning every yard for a flash of yellow. Nothing. The little neighborhood park came next, the single wooden swing hanging motionless, creaking faintly in the wind, utterly deserted. Halfway down the second block, she spotted Mr. Henderson kneeling in his front yard, pruning shears in hand, working at his rose bushes before the frost could get to them. "Mr. Henderson." Sarah shouted, sprinting toward his yard. "Did you see my sister? Did you see Lily walk by?" The old man straightened up slowly, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Lily, the little one?" "No, I haven't seen her today. Been out here since about 3, trying to beat the frost. It's been awful quiet all afternoon." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Mr. Henderson had been outside since 3, and his yard sat directly along the route. He would have seen Lily walk past. There was no way to miss her, which meant one horrifying thing. Lily never made it that far. Sarah didn't even manage a proper thank you before she was running again. Faster now, lungs burning against the cold air, eyes darting under parked cars and behind tree trunks, searching every possible hiding place a small child could disappear into. She reached the corner of Elm and Maple, chest heaving, and turned in a slow, frantic circle. The stone wall where she waited every day sat empty. The street was silent. There was nowhere for a 7-year-old to vanish to. It was a straight, open stretch of sidewalk with nothing but houses on either side. And then she saw it. About 20 feet from the corner, resting on top of the low stone wall that bordered their property line, sat a small object, bright red against the gray afternoon. Sarah's legs felt impossibly heavy as she walked toward it, each step slower than the last, some part of her already understanding what she was about to find, and refusing to let the rest of her believe it. It was Lily's lunchbox, but it hadn't been dropped. It hadn't been thrown aside in a panic. It was sitting upright, deliberately placed, the small handle folded neatly down flat, as if someone had set it there gently, carefully, the way you'd set something down when you needed both your hands free for something else entirely. Sarah reached out and touched the plastic. It was completely dry. It hadn't been sitting there long. Lily, the word tore out of her. Not a call anymore, but a scream, raw and desperate, ripping through the quiet street and bouncing off the sides of the houses. Silence answered her. The kind of silence that feels, on some primal level, entirely wrong. Within 20 minutes, Oakage transformed from a sleepy autumn afternoon into a scene of pure chaos. Martha's car screeched to a stop at the corner before the engine had even fully died, and she was out of the driver's seat and running before the door swung shut behind her. Thomas arrived moments later in his work truck, his face the color of ash. Sarah stood frozen by the stone wall, clutching the lunchbox to her chest like it might disappear too as she let go, tears streaming freely down her face as she tried, through broken sobs, to explain everything. The locked door to the empty house, Mr. Henderson's answer, the lunchbox sitting there so perfectly, so deliberately placed. Martha grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, practically hyperventilating. "You found this here?" "Right here." "She set it down, Mom," Sarah sobbed. "It was just sitting there." Thomas wasted no time on words. He went door to door along the intersection, knocking hard, asking anyone and everyone if they'd seen his daughter. The two brothers who'd gotten off the bus with Lily were questioned by their mother. They watched Lily start walking toward home, then gone straight inside without a second glance. That was all anyone knew. By 5 o'clock, the sun had disappeared entirely behind the thickening clouds, and the neighborhood sank into an early, unnatural darkness. Streetlights flickered on, throwing long, distorted shadows across manicured lawns. The police arrived. Chief Miller. No relation to the family, a coincidence that would confuse people for weeks, was the first patrol car on scene. 30 years on the Oakage force, and all that time he'd handled runaway teenagers, lost dogs, the occasional drunk and disorderly. He had never once handled a child vanishing into thin air in the middle of the afternoon. More neighbors spilled out of their homes. A search party assembled almost spontaneously. Men with flashlights disappearing into the small patch of woods behind the subdivision, women checking sheds and garages up and down the block. The entire town had been shaken awake. "We need a timeline," Chief Miller said to Thomas, notepad in hand under the harsh glow of a streetlight. Bus driver says she dropped her at 3:15. Sarah walked her out at 3:45 and saw nothing. Thomas said hollowly, "And Mr. Henderson was outside from 3 onward. Says she never passes house." The chief studied the map in his head. "That puts the window at half a block. 15 to 20 minutes. Maybe less. An impossibly small window. An impossibly small stretch of open sidewalk. How does a child disappear from 300 feet of empty street in broad daylight? Was she upset about anything?" the chief asked gently. "Trouble at school? Any reason she'd run off?" "She's 7. Martha snapped, her carefully held composure finally cracking wide open. "She doesn't run away. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat. You could see her from a mile away." Someone took her. Someone took her. The words hung there in the freezing air, heavier than anything anyone wanted to acknowledge. A kidnapping. An oakage. It was unthinkable. And yet, as the hours dragged on and the darkness deepened, it was becoming the only explanation left standing. By 8 that night, state police had arrived with 2 K9 units, large, focused tracking dogs trained to follow human scent. An officer carefully presented Lily's lunchbox to the lead dog, a German shepherd, who sniffed it intently before his handler gave a command to search. The entire street watched in silence as the dogs began to move. They started at the stone wall, circled it tightly, moved toward the sidewalk. Sarah held her breath, her mother's hand gripping hers hard enough to leave marks. If the dogs could track her, maybe she was just hiding somewhere close. Maybe she was scared and curled up behind a bush, waiting to be found. But the dogs only made it 4 steps, from the stone wall to the very edge of the curb, before they stopped cold. They circled the same small patch of asphalt 3 times, whining confused, looking back up at their handler for an explanation he didn't have. "What is it?" Thomas demanded, stepping forward. Did they lose the scent? The handler reset the dogs and tried again. Same result, exact same spot. "They didn't lose the scent, Mr. Miller," he said quietly. "It doesn't fade. It just stops, right here on the curb." A visible shiver moved through the crowd of gathered neighbors. "What does that mean?" Martha whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. Chief Miller's face had gone gray. "It means she didn't walk away from the spot on her own 2 feet. She was put into a vehicle." The words landed like a physical blow. Martha's knees buckled, and she collapsed against Thomas, letting out a sound Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob, something in between, something that came from somewhere far deeper than either. A car. A vehicle had pulled up right beside her sister. The lunchbox had been set down carefully, deliberately, and then she was simply gone. "Did anyone see a car?" the chief called out the crowd. "Any strange vehicles?" "Delivery trucks." People exchanged uncertain glances, shaking their heads. It was mid-afternoon on a weekday. Most adults were at work. The street mostly empty of witnesses. Then a quiet, trembling voice spoke up from the back of the crowd. It was Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived directly across from the bus stop, clutching her cardigan tight around her thin shoulders against the cold. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," she said nervously. "My eyes are what they used to be. But around 3 o'clock, before the bus even came, I saw a car parked under the big oak tree near the park. Just sitting there." Chief Miller turned to her sharply. "What kind of car?" "A sedan," she said slowly, working to pull the memory into focus. "Silver or maybe light gray. Clean looking. The engine was running. I remember because I could see the exhaust in the cold air. It just sat there idling for a long time. Did you see the driver?" "No. The windows were tinted, or maybe it was just the glare off the clouds. I couldn't tell. And then, when I went inside, put the kettle on, I heard it drive off. Must have been around 3:20. A silver sedan. Parked, waiting, watching." Sarah felt her legs give out beneath her, and she sank down onto the cold grass. She should have been there. If she hadn't stayed after school for that meeting, she'd have been sitting on that very wall, holding her sister's hand, and none of this would have happened. Instead, a stranger had watched a 7-year-old girl step off a bus completely alone, had watched her walk down that quiet street, and in the span of a few silent minutes beneath the gray autumn sky, had taken her away forever. Roadblocks went up that night. Statewide alerts went out. Every silver sedan within 50 miles came under scrutiny. But as the night dragged toward morning and the cold wind kept scraping dead leaves across empty streets, the horrifying truth began to settle in over the entire town. There were no tire tracks in the hard asphalt, no witnesses to the actual moment it happened, no sign of any struggle at all. Just a red plastic lunchbox sitting neatly on a stone wall, and a little girl who had vanished as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her whole. The nightmare had only just begun, and not even Sarah, 12 years old, standing frozen on that dark street corner, Could imagine how long that nightmare was going to last, with a horrifying secret waiting decades in the future to tear her family apart all over again. The night stretched into a waking hell that none of them would ever fully wake up from. Past midnight, the Miller house transformed from a warm family home into a chaotic command center. The front door hung open, letting the freezing wind sweep straight through the hallway. Uniformed officers tracked mud and dead leaves across the living room carpet. The dining table, where the family had eaten dinner together just 24 hours earlier, now disappeared beneath topographical maps of the county, lit by harsh, battery-powered work lamps. Thomas and Martha sat together on the living room sofa, surrounded by frantic activity, yet utterly disconnected from it, like ghosts haunting their own house. Martha hadn't stopped shaking since she'd arrived at the scene. She sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring blankly at the front window, waiting for a flash of yellow to appear out of the darkness. Thomas sat beside her, jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped his cheek, answering the same questions over and over from a rotating cast of officers, his voice slowly wearing down to a dry, hoarse whisper. Sarah was kept in the kitchen with a female officer who offered her a glass of water. She couldn't bring herself to drink. Every time the police radio on the counter crackled with static, she flinched violently, certain that this time, someone would say the word she was praying for. But the radio only ever delivered updates about empty streets and dead ends. When the sun rose the next morning, it brought no comfort with it. The gray clouds had thickened overnight, casting a dull, sickly light over the whole neighborhood. But the search effort exploded in scale. By 8 a.m., nearly 300 volunteers had gathered in the parking lot of the community church. The entire town shut down. The hardware store stayed locked. The bank ran on half its usual staff. Teachers wept quietly in the break room. Volunteers organized into grid search teams. Thick jackets and heavy boots, walking sticks to push through the underbrush. Sarah refused to stay home. She needed to move. She needed to do something to fix what she felt she had broken. For 10 grueling hours, she walked shoulder to shoulder with her father through the cold, damp woods behind the subdivision, checking every hollow log, every drainage ditch, every thicket of blackberry brambles, ignoring the thorns tearing at her hands and clothes. Hundreds of voices calling Lily's name echoed through the trees, a haunting chorus that grew weaker and more desperate as the day wore on. They found nothing. No dropped mitten, no footprint, no scrap of yellow fabric snagged on a branch. The woods were completely, terribly empty. The realization settled over the search party like a suffocating blanket. Lily hadn't wandered off and gotten lost. She hadn't fallen somewhere and been unable to call for help. The theory of the silver sedan was no longer just a possibility. It was the only reality left standing. By the end of that first week, it was clear the local police were completely out of their depth. Chief Miller formally requested help from the state police and the FBI, and almost overnight the quiet streets of Oakage filled with unmarked black cars and men in sharp suits. The investigation shifted hard from a missing person search into a full criminal abduction case. Tracking down the silver sedan in 1984 was a nightmare of manual labor. No highway cameras, no license plate readers, no searchable databases. Investigators pulled paper DMV records for every silver or light gray sedan registered within 50 miles, a list that ballooned past 4,000 vehicles. Detectives went door to door, checking alibis, questioning owners, visiting body shops in case anyone had brought in a car for a hasty paint job or interior cleaning. A tip line opened, begging the public for any sighting of a suspicious silver car near the school or the park. But Mrs. Gable's description, however honest, was tragically thin. No make, no model, no idea whether it had 2 doors or 4. No plate number, not even partial. She couldn't even say for certain whether the driver had been a man or a woman. The silver sedan had appeared under that oak tree, swallowed a 7-year-old girl whole, and vanished without leaving behind a single meaningful trace. With the physical search stalling, the investigation turned inward, as it always eventually does, toward the family itself. On the 10th day, 2 state detectives brought Thomas and Martha in for formal interviews, seated in separate windowless rooms, no longer treated as grieving parents but as potential suspects. They asked about the hardware store's finances. They asked about gambling debts, hidden enemies, whether Thomas had ever lost his temper with Lily. He sat through it with his exhaustion curdling slowly into fury, providing an airtight alibi, customers, employees, timestamps, that cleared him completely, but the damage to his trust in the system had already been done. Martha's interview was worse. Detectives press her on why she let a 7-year-old walk home alone, the implication of negligence hanging unspoken but unmistakable in every question. She broke down entirely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Her own grief twisted into something that felt like an accusation. Her alibi from the bank was ironclad. The emotional wound was not so easily cleared. Sarah's suffering, in its own quiet way, may have been the worst of all. She stopped attending school entirely, spending her days sitting on the floor of the bedroom she shared with her sister, staring at Lily's neatly made bed, at the stuffed animals lined up in their usual rows, waiting for a little girl who was never coming back to rearrange them. A child psychologist working alongside the police came to interview her gently, walking her back to the same terrible details again and again. The morning routine, the walk home, the discovery of the lunchbox. "It's my fault," Sarah whispered during one of those sessions, eyes locked on the floor. "I told her I'd be there. I traded her life for a science project." No amount of gentle reassurance from the psychologist reached her. In Sarah's mind, the math was brutally simple. If she had skipped that meeting, she would have been at the bus stop. She would have held her sister's hand. She would have looked the driver of that silver car directly in the eyes, and Lily would still be home. That crushing weight of guilt settled onto 12-year-old shoulders and stayed there, quietly reshaping the entire trajectory of her life. Weeks folded into a month. The frantic energy of the early investigation slowly gave way to a grim, exhausted silence. The command center moved out of the Miller house and back to the station. The phone rang less and less. The missing person flyers taped to every telephone pole in town began to weather in the November rain, ink fading, edges curling, until they hung by single corners, flapping uselessly in the wind. Thanksgiving arrived and passed like a hollow wound. No extended family came. Martha didn't cook. Thomas sat in his armchair staring at a television he never bothered to turn on. Lily's empty chair at the table radiated a silence none of them knew how to speak into. The town itself never recovered its former ease. The deep sense of safety that had defined Oakage for generations shattered in a single afternoon. Parents no longer let their kids play unsupervised in the front yard. The walk to the bus stop became a heavily guarded daily ritual, parents standing at every corner, gripping small hands, eyes scanning constantly for unfamiliar cars. The town's innocence had been stolen just as completely, and just as suddenly, as Lily herself. That winter brought a parade of false leads, each one almost more painful than silence would have been. In early December, a truck driver called in a tip. He'd seen a little girl matching Lily's description at a roadside diner in Ohio, 300 miles away, wearing a yellow raincoat, seemingly frightened the man she was traveling with. Police mobilized instantly. The family sat frozen in their living room, not daring to breathe. Martha already in her coat, ready to drive across 3 states the second word came back. 3 agonizing hours later, Chief Miller pulled into the driveway. He didn't even radio ahead. He wanted to deliver the news himself. It was a grandfather traveling with his own granddaughter, crying in the diner because she dropped her ice cream cone. A complete, heartbreaking misunderstanding. Martha collapsed on the front porch, and her scream of pure frustration and grief echoed down the quiet street. After that day, she stopped answering the phone altogether. She simply couldn't survive another swing between sudden hope and devastating collapse. By February of 1985, for months after Lily disappeared, snow sat piled high along the sidewalks of Oakage, and the case had officially gone cold. Leads had dried up completely. The FBI agents packed their files and moved on to newer, more solvable cases. Only one investigator refused to let it go. His name was Detective Reynolds, a quiet, methodical state police investigator known for an almost obsessive attention to detail. Reynolds didn't believe in bad luck. He believed in logic. And he believed every crime had a flaw somewhere in its structure, waiting to be found by anyone patient enough to look for it. He spent his days in a cramped office of the precinct, staring at a bulletin board plastered with timelines, maps, and interview transcripts, circling back again and again to one detail that refused to sit right with him. The window of opportunity was too tight, too clean. A kidnapper had successfully snatched a child in broad daylight on a residential street in under 10 minutes, without leaving a single trace of evidence and without being seen by anyone except one elderly woman with failing eyesight. That kind of precision didn't happen by accident. He studied the timeline again. Bus drop-off at 3:15. Sarah's arrival at 3:45. The silver sedan spotted idling at 3 o'clock, 30 minutes before the bus was even due. That detail snagged in his mind like a splinter. The car wasn't cruising the neighborhood looking for an opportunity. It was parked, waiting, watching a specific route. But Lily never walked that route alone. Not once. Not since the school year started. If this had been a crime of opportunity, some random predator driving by who happened to spot an unattended child, they have simply seen her and taken her on the spot. They wouldn't have parked and waited 30 minutes before the bus even arrived. Waiting implied knowledge. Waiting implied expectation. Whoever was driving that car expected Lily to be alone that day. But how could anyone possibly have known that in advance? The decision for Sarah to stay late hadn't been made a week ahead of time. It wasn't a standing appointment. It was decided that very morning at breakfast in their own kitchen. Reynolds pulled Sarah's original interview transcript and ran his finger down the page until he found the relevant exchange. Question: why didn't you meet your sister that day? Answer: I had a science project meeting. I told my mom in the kitchen before school. My partner could only meet that afternoon in the library. He picked up the phone and called the middle school, confirming the details of the science project, then asked the name of Sarah's partner, a girl named Emily Vance. Reynolds drove straight to the school that afternoon. He sat with Emily, now 13, in the principal's office, watching her fidget nervously under the weight of his badge. Sarah stayed after school that day to work on a project with you, he said gently. She told her mother you could only meet that afternoon. Do you remember that? Emily shook her head, clearly confused. I didn't tell her that, sir. Our project wasn't due for another 2 weeks. I was actually planning to go home that day. But right before lunch, the office sent a note to my classroom. It said Sarah needed to work on it right away because she was going out of town that weekend. So I met her in the library like the note said. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through Reynolds' chest. He thanked her, left the office, and went straight to the front desk, where an older secretary kept meticulous, handwritten phone logs. I need your call records from October 14th, he said, specifically the morning. She pulled a thick binder from beneath the counter and flipped back through the pages until she found the entry. 9:45 a.m. here, she said, pointing to the faded blue ink. A call came in for Sarah Miller. Who called? Says here it was Sarah's mother. She squinted at her own handwriting. The caller said there was a family emergency that weekend, and Sarah needed to finish a project right away. Asked me to pass along a message to both Sarah and Emily to meet in the library after school. Reynolds felt the air leave his lungs. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Martha Miller had been sitting behind the counter at the bank at 9:45 that morning. He'd seen her time cards himself. And more importantly, Martha hadn't even known about the science project meeting until Sarah mentioned it at breakfast, well after 9. Martha hadn't made that call. She couldn't have made that call. Did you speak to the caller yourself? He pressed, his voice dropping low. Was it a woman's voice? Did it sound like Mrs. Miller? The secretary frowned, thinking back through months of memory to that unremarkable Tuesday morning. No, she said slowly. It wasn't a woman. It was a man. Very polite voice. Said he was calling on her mother's behalf. I just assumed it was her father, or maybe an uncle helping out. Reynolds stepped back from the desk, his mind racing with implications that felt almost too large to hold. This hadn't been a random crime of opportunity. It hadn't been a stranger who simply happened to be driving down Elm Street at the wrong moment. Someone had planned this, meticulously, patiently. Someone had known the family schedule down to the hour. Someone had known the name of Sarah's science partner. And someone had deliberately manipulated the school's administrative system to trap Sarah in the library, guaranteeing that 7-year-old Lily would walk that quiet street entirely alone. The predator hadn't just been waiting in a silver car outside. The predator had been watching this family from the inside. Armed with this terrifying new piece of the puzzle, the state police tore back into the investigation with renewed urgency, immediately requesting a trace on the 9:45 a.m. phone call. But this was 1984. There was no caller ID for the general public, and local calls from home phones or payphones simply vanished into the ether the second the receiver hit the cradle. The trail hit a wall that no amount of determination could break through. Desperate, investigators brought Emily Vance's entire family in for questioning. Her father, a local accountant, had an airtight alibi surrounded by a dozen co-workers. Her mother, a nurse, had been mid-shift at the county hospital. Both were cleared without hesitation. Detectives asked whether anyone else might have known about the project, but the family seemed just as bewildered as everyone else. And here is where the investigation made its fatal, decades-long error. Police were hunting for an adult man, a seasoned, patient predator driving a silver sedan. Locked into that profile, they never once thought to look at the other person living in that Vance household. Emily's 18-year-old brother, a quiet senior finishing out his final year at Oak Ridge High School, just a few miles down the road. Without a name attached to that phone call, the trail went cold once more, and this time it stayed cold for 27 years. Time has a cruel, indifferent way of moving forward regardless of what it leaves unresolved behind it. Days folded into weeks. Weeks hardened into months, and months eventually calcified into years. The missing person posters that once covered every storefront in Oak Ridge yellowed, curled, and were eventually blown away entirely by winter winds nobody bothered to notice anymore. The story of the little girl in a yellow raincoat drifted from front-page news to a brief anniversary mention buried in the back pages, and then, eventually, it stopped appearing at all. For the Millers, the years that followed were a long, agonizing erosion. Thomas became a quiet shell of the man he used to be, spent his evenings on the front porch, staring down the empty street, waiting for a daughter who was never going to come walking around that corner. The strain wore down his body as surely as it wore down his spirit, and in the winter of 2006, he died of a sudden heart attack, having never once learned who had taken his youngest child from him. Martha's decline followed a different, equally devastating path. Without a body, without a funeral, without a grave to visit and grieve properly, some part of her mind simply refused to accept that Lily was truly gone. That refusal calcified over the years into early-onset dementia. As she aged, she began setting an extra place at the dinner table without noticing. She'd buy children's cereal at the grocery store out of some deep, unexamined instinct. Eventually, it became unsafe for her to live alone, and she needed full-time care. That left Sarah. By the autumn of 2011, Sarah Miller was 39 years old, and her entire adult life had been shaped, bent really, into an entirely different shape than it might otherwise have taken, by the 10 minutes she'd spent in a middle school library back in 1984. The guilt had never once loosened its grip on her chest. She had never left Oak Ridge, terrified on some irrational level that if she moved away, Lily might somehow come home to find the house empty. She'd become a second-grade teacher, walking the same elementary school hallways her little sister once walked. She had a daughter of her own now, a bright, energetic 7-year-old named Maya. The exact age Lily had been the day she vanished, because of that unbearable symmetry. Sarah had become a fiercely, almost obsessively protective mother. She drove Maya to school every single morning. She picked her up the instant the bell rang. She never allowed her daughter to play unsupervised in the front yard, never let her walk to a friend's house alone. The trauma of the past had woven itself permanently into the fabric of her present. That October, Sarah faced the most emotionally exhausting task of her adult life, moving her mother into a specialized memory care facility across town, which meant the childhood home, the house on the cul-de-sac, the house where the nightmare had begun, finally had to be sold. She spent a full week packing it up alone. Every drawer she opened, every closet she emptied, dragged her back through time. She boxed up her father's old tools. She wrapped her mother's china in newspaper. And on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, she pulled down the folding attic stairs and climbed up into the dim, dusty space above the house. The attic smelled of old wood and paper gone soft with age, rain drumming steadily against the roof just above her head. Boxes and sheet-draped furniture crowded every corner. She spent hours sorting through forgotten tax documents and long-abandoned holiday decorations before finding, tucked beneath a heavy winter quilt in the back corner, a large cedar chest belonging to her mother. The place, she realized instantly, where Martha had hidden away everything too painful to look at on an ordinary day. Sarah wiped away the dust and opened the lid, the hinges groaning loudly in the silence. Inside sat a collection of heartbreaking relics. The red plastic lunchbox, returned by police in 1988 when the evidence locker was finally cleared out. The math worksheet Sarah had been rushing to finish that final morning. And at the very bottom, beneath a stack of old coloring books, a heavy manila envelope, its paper gone stiff and brittle with age. She read the return address stamped in the corner. Oak Haven Portraits, Fall 1984 School Pictures. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew instantly what this was. Back then, a local photography company had taken the school's annual portraits in late September, processed a film, and mailed the finished packets directly to parents in late October. This envelope must have arrived in the mail just weeks after Lily disappeared, landing in a house full of grieving parents and police officers who simply couldn't bear to open it. They had tucked it away in the dark instead, and it had stayed there, sealed for 27 years. Sarah sat down hard on the wooden floorboards, hands trembling as she stared at the sealed flap. She felt, in that moment, like she was holding a ghost. Slowly, she slid her thumb beneath the dried glue and tore it open. The first photo she pulled free was a standard studio portrait, 2 large prints and a sheet of wallet-sized copies. Sarah stared at the image, and hot tears spilled instantly down her cheeks. It was Lily, red knitted sweater, messy curls pushed back behind her ears, that same gap-toothed smile beaming directly at the camera, and there, just visible at the edge of her collar, the tiny crescent moon birthmark. She looked so happy, so safe. Sarah traced her fingertip over the glossy surface, a broken sob escaping her throat. But there was a second sheet in the envelope. The studio's Playground Candids package, natural shots taken during recess that parents could purchase as an add-on. 3 of the 4 photos were entirely unremarkable. Lily sitting on the grass, Lily tying her shoe. But the 4th photograph stopped Sarah's heart cold. It was a wide shot. Lily stood near the edge of the schoolyard, laughing at something happening just outside the frame. The photographer's focus was sharp enough to catch not just Lily in the foreground, but the entire background behind her, including the tall chain-link fence separating the playground from the public street, and, parked directly beyond it, a silver sedan. The air rushed out of Sarah's lungs. The car, the exact car from the police reports. The car Mrs. Gable had described idling under the oak tree. It hadn't just been in the neighborhood on the day Lily disappeared. It had been at her school, watching her weeks before. And that wasn't the most terrifying detail in the frame. Leaning against the hood of that silver sedan, arms crossed, stood a young man. He wasn't glancing casually at the playground the way any passerby might. His head was tilted at a specific angle, his gaze locked with unmistakable, unsettling focus directly on Lily. Sarah scrambled backward, her spine hitting the dusty attic wall. Unable to catch her breath, with shaking hands, she pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and photographed the old picture, then zoomed in as far as the digital resolution would allow. The face was slightly grainy but perfectly clear, dark hair parted to the side, a strong jaw, deep-set eyes, and his clothing told her everything else she needed to know. A heavy wool Letterman jacket with white leather sleeves, the number 84 stitched clearly onto the left arm, a graduation year. He was a high school senior. Sarah's mind began racing at a speed that felt almost violent. A high school senior, a teenager. The police had spent thousands of hours hunting for a middle-aged predator behind the wheel of a silver sedan. They had never once considered that a teenager might be driving a hand-me-down car still registered under his parents' name. And there was something else. Something buried far beneath decades of grief and trauma that had suddenly, violently surfaced. She knew that face. She'd seen it before, somewhere in her own childhood. She threw herself toward a stack of boxes in the corner, her own boxes, her own childhood belongings, and tore through them frantically until she found what she was searching for. Her father's collection of Oak Ridge High School yearbooks, purchased every year regardless of whether any of them attended, simply because Thomas liked keeping a record of the town. She pulled out the thick blue volume stamped 1984, flipped past the freshman, sophomore, and junior sections, and landed on senior portraits. Her finger traced down the alphabetical rows of smiling faces until it reached the letter V. And there he was, dark hair parted to the side, strong jaw, deep-set eyes, an exact, undeniable match to the young man leaning against the silver sedan in that playground photograph. Beneath the picture, printed in bold black ink, was a name, Mark Vance. Sarah clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle the scream clawing its way up her throat. Mark Vance, Emily Vance's older brother. The attic seemed to tilt around her. The full, devastating reality of what had actually happened in 1984 crashed down all at once. The kidnapper had never been a stranger. He had been the older brother of her own science partner, a boy who would have been sitting at that very kitchen table when Emily mentioned her school project. A boy who would have known exactly who Sarah Miller was, would have known she was the one who walked her little sister home every single afternoon. And on the morning of October 14th, an 18-year-old with a calm, mature voice had picked up his home telephone, called the middle school, and impersonated an adult calling on Martha Miller's behalf, engineering the entire situation with cold, calculated precision, ensuring that his target would be walking alone. And because he was nothing more than a local teenager, the police had never so much as glanced in his direction. Sarah sat alone in that dim attic for a long time, the yearbook heavy in her lap, shock slowly curdling into something colder and sharper, a rage that had been quietly building for 27 years, finally given a name, finally given a face. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She'd watched the system fail her family for decades, and she wasn't about to trust it blindly now. A 27-year-old photograph of a teenager leaning against a car was deeply suspicious, but it wasn't absolute proof of a kidnapping. Vance could easily claim he'd simply been waiting to pick up his sister from school that day. He could dismiss the phone call as coincidence, and if she went to the authorities prematurely, they might open an inquiry that would inevitably tip him off, giving him time to vanish all over again, or worse. She needed to know more. She needed to find out exactly where he was now. Grabbing the photograph, her phone, and the yearbook, she rushed downstairs to her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard with an urgency that felt like it might shatter something inside her. It was 2011. The world had changed dramatically since 1984. People couldn't hide the way they once could. Public records lived online now, searchable, cross-referenced, waiting to be found by anyone patient enough to dig. She started with property records for Oakage and found that the Vance family home had sold in December 1985, barely over a year after Lily disappeared. The entire family had moved away almost immediately. She searched Mark Vance, adding his approximate current age, 45. Dozens of results scattered across the country. Mark Vance's who were doctors, lawyers, none of them matching. She narrowed the search, pairing his name with his sister's, and on the second page of results found an online obituary from 2008 for a woman named Helen Vance, survived by her daughter Emily, living in Chicago, and her son Mark, residing in a small town called Clear Creek, New York. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Clear Creek, a rural town roughly 4 hours north of Oakage. She searched again, Mark Vance, Clear Creek, New York. The first result was a business website, Vance Landscaping and Design, simple green and white text, offering lawn care and patio installation. Her hand hovered over the mouse, trembling, before she clicked through to the About Us page. A high-resolution photo, loaded at the center of the screen. Mark Vance, 45 years old now, dark hair heavily streaked with gray, deep lines etched around his eyes, but unmistakably, undeniably, the same man from the yearbook photo. The same man who had leaned against that silver sedan, watching a 7-year-old play. He wasn't alone in the picture. Standing beside him, one arm casually around his waist, was a woman. The caption beneath the photo read, Mark Vance founded Vance Landscaping in 1995. He runs daily operations alongside his wife, Chloe, who manages the office and customer relations. Sarah's eyes moved slowly from the text up to the woman's face, and the room around her seemed to drop several degrees. She leaned closer to the glowing screen until her nose nearly touched it. The woman, Chloe, looked to be in her mid-30s. Thick, messy brown curls. A gap-toothed smile long since corrected by braces, but the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the particular way her nose crinkled when she smiled. It was unmistakable. It was exact. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp tearing loose from somewhere deep in her chest. She saved the image and zoomed in directly on the woman's collarbone, visible above the neckline of a light summer dress. And there was, small, faint, unmistakable, a tiny crescent moon-shaped birthmark resting just below her left collarbone. Sarah's chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as she stumbled backward, the room spinning around her, the truth so monstrous her mind fought to reject it even as the evidence sat glowing right in front of her. Lily wasn't dead. She hadn't been murdered in some patch of woods decades ago. Mark Vance had kidnapped a 7-year-old girl, hidden her from the entire world, isolated her completely. And then, once she was old enough, he had rewritten her reality so thoroughly that he had made her his wife. Lily was alive. She was living 4 hours away, and she had absolutely no idea who she really was. Sarah sat frozen in front of that screen for what felt like hours, the harsh glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the empty living room. Her mind kept trying to reject what her eyes were plainly telling her, but the evidence fit together with a horrifying, undeniable precision. The birthmark, the smile, the yearbook photo, all of it locking into place like the final pieces of a puzzle nobody had wanted solved. A wave of physical nausea rolled through her. She staggered to the kitchen sink and gripped the cold porcelain edge, gasping for air, trying to absorb the full, monstrous scope of what Mark Vance had done. He hadn't just stolen a child. He had groomed her, erased her past, convinced her, over years of careful, patient manipulation, that her family either didn't exist or hadn't wanted her. He had built an impenetrable wall of lies around an innocent little girl and lived safely behind it for nearly 3 decades. When the initial shock finally began to fade, it left behind something colder and far more focused, a sharp, protective, maternal fury. Sarah understood immediately that she couldn't simply hand this over to the police. The Oakage Department had already failed her family catastrophically once, missing the connection to high school, missing the silver sedan parked at the playground. If she alerted them now, the bureaucracy would move slowly and loudly. Phone calls would be made. Local authorities in New York would be alerted. And Mark Vance, a man who had orchestrated a flawless, decades-long abduction, was not a fool. If he caught even a whisper that his secret was unraveling, he would run. He might take Lily with him and disappear forever. Or, worse, if he understood he was about to lose everything and face the rest of his life in prison, there was no telling what he might do. A clumsy police raid risked turning into a hostage situation. And Lily didn't know she was a victim. As far as she understood her own life, Mark was her husband. She might panic. She might defend him. Sarah couldn't risk a confrontation that ended with her sister hurt, or worse. She had to do this herself. She had to be the one to look her sister in the eye and show her the truth before Mark ever suspected a thing was wrong. The next morning, Sarah moved with quiet, deliberate precision. She called the school and requested emergency family leave, citing her mother's declining health. Not entirely a lie, just not the whole truth either. She dropped Maya off her friend's house, telling her she needed to sort out some difficult paperwork related to her father's estate. And before leaving town, she made one final stop at her mother's empty house, climbing back into that attic to retrieve the cedar chest one more time. She took the Oakhaven envelope, and then carefully, she picked up the red plastic lunchbox, wiped away the dust, folded its little handle down flat, and set it on the passenger seat of her car. It was her anchor, the one physical object left in the world that still connected Lily to the days she'd been stolen. The drive to Clear Creek took 4 hours, though to Sarah felt endless, the highway cutting through dense gray forest and rolling hills beneath a sky the exact same flat, heavy gray as it had been on that terrible Tuesday in 1984. The farther north she drove, the more isolated the landscape became, towns growing smaller and further apart until the highways narrowed into quiet Tulane County roads flanked by thick pine trees. It was, she realized with a chill, the perfect place to disappear someone. Clear Creek turned out to be a tiny rural community, a single main street holding a gas station, a small grocery store, a hardware supply shop, and a post office. Houses that spread far apart across long gravel driveways, separated by acres of dense woods. Out here, privacy wasn't just respected. It was practically built into the geography. She found Vance Landscaping and Design on the edge of town, sitting on a large plot of land at the end of a dead-end road, a modest two-story house painted dull gray, set far back from the street, with a massive corrugated steel garage attached where equipment was stored. 3 heavy company pickup trucks sat parked in the wide gravel driveway. Sarah didn't pull in. She drove past slowly, heart hammering, continued a quarter-mile down the road, and eased her car onto a narrow dirt shoulder hidden by a thick line of spruce trees. From there, she had a clear view of the front of the house and the main driveway. Then she settled in to wait. For 3 hours, nothing moved. Just after 1 in the afternoon, the garage door rattled open with a loud metallic groan, and a man stepped out. Sarah ducked instinctively, though she was far too distant to be seen, and raised a pair of small binoculars she brought from her father's old hunting gear. It was Mark Vance. The lean high school senior was long gone, replaced by a thick, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, moving with a heavy, authoritative swagger, barking orders at 2 younger crew members loading shovels and fertilizer bags into the truck beds. Sarah watched him with a wave of revulsion crawling over her skin. This was the man who had stalked her little sister from behind a chain-link fence. This was the polite voice on the phone that morning, and he looked so devastatingly ordinary. Nothing about him broadcast a monster underneath. Then the front door of the house opened. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A woman stepped out onto the porch, holding a stack of clipboards and a set of keys, walking down the steps toward Mark in the driveway. Through the binoculars, Sarah finally saw her sister move, breathe, exist in real life, and the digital photograph on her computer screen had done nothing to prepare her for the raw, visceral shock of it. It was Lily, older now, framed by the same thick brown curls, but the features underneath were unmistakably the same. She looked so much like their mother had looked at that age that Sarah had to press a hand hard against her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Every instinct told her to throw open the car door, sprint down the road, tackle Mark to the gravel, and pull her sister into her arms. She forced herself to stay perfectly still instead. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before she made her move. What she watched through those lenses over the next few minutes was deeply disturbing. There was no warmth between them, no casual affection. Lily handed over the clipboards, her posture slightly stooped, eyes fixed on the ground. Mark snatched them from her hands without a word of thanks, flipped through the pages roughly, and jabbed a finger toward the house, issuing some sharp command. Lily nodded quickly and stepped back, and just before she turned to go, Mark reached out and gripped the back of her neck. It wasn't affectionate. It was heavy, possessive. His fingers pressed into her skin hard enough to give her a small, forceful shake. Lily didn't flinch. She simply stood still until he released her, then turned and hurried back inside. Closing the door softly behind her, Sarah lowered the binoculars, furious tears blurring her vision. The psychological control was absolute. Mark didn't treat her like a partner. He treated her like property. For the next 2 days, Sarah lived out of her car in a cheap motel 3 towns over, meticulously tracking their routine. Mark and his crew left the property every morning around 7:30 and rarely returned before late afternoon. Lily never once left the property herself. There was no personal vehicle in sight, only the heavy commercial trucks. Once Mark was gone, she spent her days in complete isolation, checking the mailbox at the end of the driveway, sweeping the front porch, sitting alone on a wooden bench in the yard, staring at nothing but the dense wall of trees surrounding her, a ghost trapped on a remote piece of land, entirely dependent on the man who had stolen her. Needing more context before making her move, Sarah visited the small Clear Creek Town Hall, posing as a background investigator for an insurance company to request public records on Mark and Chloe Vance. She found their marriage certificate, dated May 1996. The math hit her like a physical blow. Lily would have been 19 years old. Mark would have been 30. He had kept her hidden for 12 years, patiently waiting until she was legally an adult before binding her to him permanently on paper. But it was the background details on Chloe that revealed just how deep his deception had run. Her listed maiden name was Adams. Her birthplace was an obscure, unincorporated township in a neighboring state. No social security number appeared on file. Only a note indicating a delayed filing. "Excuse me," Sarah asked the clerk, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Do you have any school records for Chloe Vance or Chloe Adams? Did she attend the local high school?" The clerk shook her head. "No, dear. I remember when Mark brought her to town back in the early 90s. Said she was a runaway he'd taken in. Rough life. No family to speak of. Said he homeschooled her himself. They always kept to themselves. Quiet folks." The sickness in Sarah's stomach twisted tighter. A runaway. He had convinced an entire town that he'd rescued a troubled teenager. And because Clear Creek was the kind of place that minded its own business, nobody had ever asked a single difficult question. Nobody had ever looked closely at the terrified girl with the brown curls standing quietly at his side. He had successfully rewritten her entire existence. An isolated town had simply accepted the story without blinking. Sarah left the town hall and sat in her car in the parking lot, the full picture finally complete in her mind. She understood exactly how he had done it, and exactly what Lily's life had been for 27 years. The investigation, as far as she was concerned, was over. It was time for the final discovery. It was a Thursday morning. The sky over Clear Creek hung dark and heavy, threatening rain. Sarah parked in her usual hidden spot, and at exactly 7:30, the garage door groaned open. The diesel engines of the landscaping trucks roared to life. She watched through the binoculars as Mark climbed into the lead truck, his 2 crew members into the second, tires crunching against gravel as the vehicles pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road in the opposite direction. The property fell completely silent. The gray house stood alone against the dark tree line. Mark was gone, and he wouldn't be back for hours. Lily was alone. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She reached over and picked up the red lunchbox from the passenger seat, unlatching the small metal clasp to check one final time that everything was inside: the school photographs, the Oak Haven envelope, the heavy blue yearbook. She closed it, locked it tight, and stepped out into the cold morning air. Her legs felt impossibly heavy, as though she were wading through wet sand, every step carrying the weight of 27 years of grief and guilt and silence. She walked down the narrow shoulder of the road until she reached the entrance to the Vance driveway, and this time she didn't try to hide. She walked straight up the center of the gravel drive, eyes fixed on the front door, wind rustling through the tall pines surrounding the property. The house looked dark and uninviting, blinds drawn tight across every window. She reached the bottom of the porch steps. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel her own pulse pounding in her throat. She climbed the steps, 1, 2, 3, and stood inches from the heavy wooden door. On the other side of that door was the little sister she had failed to protect 27 years ago. On the other side of that door was a woman who didn't even know her own real name. Sarah raised her fist, held it hovering an inch from the wood, took one last steadying breath, and knocked. The sound cracked sharply across the quiet porch. Sarah stepped back, gripping the lunchbox against her stomach like a shield, the wind rushing to the pines in a low, steady hush. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. She almost knocked again, wondering if Lily was hiding, forbidden from answering the door while Mark was away. And then she heard the heavy slide of a deadbolt, followed by a second lock clicking open. The door cracked open a few inches. A face appeared in the gap. It was Lily, up close. The resemblance to their mother was breathtaking. The same soft brown eyes, the same curve of cheekbone, the same wild brown curls. But her expression was deeply guarded, shadowed by a nervous exhaustion that only comes from a lifetime of quiet submission. "Can I help you?" Lily asked. Her voice was soft, faintly raspy, utterly unrecognizable from the bright, loud 7-year-old Sarah still carried in her memory. Sarah's throat closed around the words she'd rehearsed the entire drive north. She was looking at the ghost who had haunted every single day of her adult life, and that ghost was breathing, speaking, standing right in front of her. "We don't buy anything," Lily added quickly, eyes darting past Sarah to scan the empty driveway. "My husband isn't home. You should go." She started to close the door. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the wood to stop it. "Wait, please wait. I'm not selling anything. I'm not a stranger." Lily hesitated. though she kept most of her body hidden behind the door. "I don't know you. You need to leave before my husband gets back." Sarah forced her voice steady, forced herself to look directly into her sister's frightened eyes. "My name is Sarah Miller. I came from Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania." The names clearly meant nothing at all. Lily simply stared back at her, blank, and the totality of that blankness told Sarah exactly how thorough the brainwashing had been. Mark had erased every geographical memory, every anchor point, everything. "I don't know where that is," Lily whispered. "Please let go of the door." Words weren't going to break through 27 years of carefully constructed lies. Sarah understood that instantly. She needed to bypass logic entirely and strike straight at whatever buried. Primal memory might still be flickering somewhere beneath the surface. Slowly, she lowered her hand from the door frame and lifted the red lunchbox instead, holding it directly in Lily's line of sight through the narrow gap. "You don't remember Oak Ridge," Sarah said, her voice trembling with everything she carried for nearly 3 decades. "But do you remember this?" Lily's eyes dropped to the object. At first her expression held only confusion, and then, as her gaze focused on the bright red plastic, the folded white handle, the small metal clasp, something in her entire body shifted violently. Her eyes widened. All the color drained from her face. Her breathing stopped completely. She stared at that lunchbox as though it might detonate. Her hands, resting against the edge of the door, began to shake. Something buried deep down was clawing its way to the surface. She had no context for feeling, no memory she could name or explain, but her body remembered. It remembered the color. It remembered the weight of it in her small hand. "Where?" Lily stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get that?" "You left on a stone wall," Sarah said softly, tears finally spilling over. "On the corner of Elm Street and Maple Drive. You put it down right before he took you." Lily let go of the door entirely, stumbling backward into the dark entryway, both hands flying up to cover her mouth. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was spotless and sterile, devoid of any personal warmth. No family photos on the walls, no decorative pillows, nothing. It felt exactly like what it was, a prison dressed up as a home. Lily backed against the hallway wall, panic rising in her chest. "Who are you? Why do you have that? What are you talking about?" "You're not Chloe Adams," Sarah said gently, walking toward her, holding the lunchbox out like an offering. "Your name is Lily. Lily Miller, and I'm your older sister." "No!" Lily shouted, squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head violently. "No, you're lying. I don't have a sister. I don't have a family. Mark found me. He saved me." The denial was desperate, frantic. The last line of defense a mind builds when the alternative means an entire reality collapsing at once. Sarah didn't argue. She set the lunchbox down on a small table in the hallway, unlatched it, and pulled out the Oak Haven envelope. "Look at me," she pleaded. "Please, Lily, just look." Lily opened her eyes and watched, trembling, as Sarah pulled out the large studio portrait. The 7-year-old in the red sweater, gap-toothed smile, messy curls. Lily stared at the photograph, her breathing slowing into short, shallow gasps. Slowly, she raised a shaking hand to her own face, tracing the line of her jaw, the shape of her nose, looking at a ghost of herself, a past she'd been told didn't exist. "Look here," Sarah whispered, pointing to the edge of the sweater's collar in the photo. "You have a birthmark shaped like a tiny crescent moon, just below your left collarbone." Lily let out a sharp, broken sob, her hand flying instinctively to her own collarbone, pressing against the fabric of her shirt directly over the mark she carried her entire life, without ever understanding its meaning. Mark had always told her it was just a random blemish, nothing worth thinking about. "Our mother used to call it your star mark," Sarah said. "She kissed it every night before you fell asleep." The wall was cracking now, the foundation of an entire false identity crumbling under the sheer weight of physical proof. Lily slid down the wall until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. "I was supposed to walk you home that day," Sarah said, kneeling in front of her. "I stayed late for a project. You got off the bus alone, and he was waiting. I spent 27 years believing it was my fault. I thought you were dead, Lily. We all did. Mark said I was a runaway. Lily sobbed into her hands. He said I was lost in the city. He said he brought me here to protect me. He said nobody wanted me. The cruelty of that lie made Sarah's blood boil hot in her veins. She pulled out the second photo sheet, the playground candids, and the heavy blue yearbook. He didn't find you in the city, Lily, she said, her voice hardening with quiet, focused fury. He stole you from our neighborhood. He planned it. She laid the playground photo on the floor in front of her sister's feet, pointing to the silver car behind the fence, to the young man leaning against its hood, watching the 7-year-old play. Lily lifted her tear-streaked face and stared. Even 27 years younger, the face was unmistakable. It was Mark. He was stalking you, Sarah explained, opening the yearbook to the senior portraits page and placing it beside the photograph, Mark Vance's name printed clearly beneath his picture. He was a senior at the local high school. He faked a phone call to trap me at school, so you'd have no choice but to walk home alone. Then he parked his car down the street. And he took you. Lily stared at the evidence spread across the floor, the photograph, the yearbook, the lunchbox, and the truth settled over her, absolute and undeniable and utterly horrifying. The man she lived with, the man she slept beside every night, the man who dictated what she wore, what she ate, when she was allowed to speak. He wasn't her savior. He was a monster who had torn her away from her mother, her father, her sister, who had stolen her entire life and buried her beneath a lie so thorough it had taken nearly 3 decades to crack. The dam finally broke completely. Lily let out a scream. Not simply grief, but something far more visceral, an unbroken sound of pure, unfiltered horror, decades of suppressed trauma crashing down all at once. She curled into herself on the floor, hands pressed hard over her ears, sobbing. Sarah wrapped her arms around her sister and held her as she shook and thrashed, crying just as hard herself, face buried in Lily's messy curls. 2 sisters, violently reunited in the wreckage of a stolen life, sitting together on the cold floor of a house that had never once been a real home. When the worst of the shock finally began to subside, leaving Lily exhausted and trembling, Sarah pulled back gently and forced her sister to meet her eyes. "We have to go," she said, urgency sharpening her voice. "Right now." He could come back for lunch. "If he finds me here, he will never let you leave." Lily glanced around the sterile house with wide, terrified eyes, and for the first time in 27 years, it no longer looked like the only home she'd ever known. It looked like a cage she had just woken up inside. "I don't have anything to pack," she whispered. "He buys everything. Nothing here is mine." "You don't need anything from this place," Sarah said fiercely. "Everything you need is in my car." She gathered the yearbook, the photographs, and the lunchbox, pulled Lily to her feet, and the 2 of them ran together down the gravel driveway, footsteps echoing in the cold morning air, not once looking back. When they reached the hidden car, Sarah helped Lily into the passenger seat, ran around to the driver's side, and hit the gas hard enough to throw gravel into the air as they sped away, leaving that dark, isolated nightmare behind them for good. Sarah didn't drive to the local Clear Creek town hall. Mark had lived in that small town for decades. He might have friends on the local force, connections she couldn't risk. Instead, she drove straight out of the county, 90 minutes at high speed, checking her rear-view mirror obsessively until they reached a larger city with a regional state police headquarters. Inside the brightly lit lobby, Lily clung to Sarah's arm, shaking uncontrollably, flinching at every loud noise and passing uniform. Sarah walked straight to the front desk and demanded the highest-ranking detective available. The desk sergeant took one look at the desperate urgency in her eyes and the red lunchbox clutched in her hands and made a phone call. 10 minutes later, they sat in a secure interview room with a senior investigator, Captain Miller, a man in his late 50s with a stern but genuinely empathetic face. Sarah didn't wait to be asked a single question. She spread the evidence across the table. The Oak Haven portrait, the playground candid, the 1984 yearbook, the property record she'd printed. In October 1984, a 7-year-old girl named Lily Miller was abducted from Oakage, Pennsylvania, she said, her voice steady, powerful, carrying 27 years of held breath. Police searched for a middle-aged man in a silver sedan. They missed a teenager who went to the local high school. He took her He moved across state lines. He changed her name to Chloe Adams, and he kept her prisoner for 27 years. She reached over and took her sister's trembling hand. This is Lily Miller, and the man who took her is named Mark Vance. He's currently running a landscaping business in Clear Creek, New York. Captain Miller stared at the table in stunned silence, studying the old photograph, the yearbook, and then finally Lily's face. He didn't need a DNA test in that moment to know he was looking at the truth. The resemblance, combined with the timeline Sarah had just laid out with such devastating clarity, was overwhelming. What followed happened fast. Within the hour, state police had contacted the FBI, coordinating a joint task force and securing a federal arrest warrant from Mark Vance. Given the extraordinary length of the abduction and the unknown psychological volatility of the situation, they didn't send a routine patrol car. They mobilized a full tactical response. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mark Vance was standing in a client's driveway, barking at his crew to load mulch faster, entirely secure in the belief he'd gotten away with it, that he had committed, as far as he was concerned, the perfect crime. He didn't even hear the vehicles approaching until they had already blocked the driveway. 3 unmarked SUVs and 2 state cruisers swarmed the property, sirens blaring, tires tearing up the grass. Before he could drop the clipboard in his hands, armed federal agents were out of their vehicles, weapons raised, shouting commands that cracked across the quiet neighborhood like thunder. "Mark Vance, get on the ground. Do it now." He froze. Whatever arrogant composure he'd worn like armor for 30 years shattered instantly. He looked at the police cars, then glanced toward the road as if some part of him expected to see Lily standing there. But there was nowhere to run. The decades of lies had finally, completely caught up with him. He lowered himself to his knees in the dirt, hands raised, and agents swarmed him, pressing his face into gravel, wrenching his arms behind his back, snapping heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. "Mark Vance, you are under arrest for the 1984 kidnapping of Lily Miller." He closed his eyes, face pressed against the dirt. The monster of Oakage had finally been caught. He would never see Lily again. He would spend the remainder of his life in a federal prison cell, stripped permanently of the control he had spent his entire adult life so desperately craving. While the raid unfolded, Lily remained safe at headquarters, sitting with victims' advocate and a trauma psychologist. Investigators took her fingerprints, later matching them perfectly to prints lifted years earlier from one of her childhood toys, still preserved in an evidence locker. The scientific confirmation was, by that point, little more than a formality. The nightmare was, at long last, officially over. But the aftermath was neither quick nor simple. There was no magical instant recovery from 27 years of psychological captivity. Lily had to slowly, painfully relearn how to exist in a world she'd been entirely hidden from her whole adult life. Sarah brought her back to Oakage, not to the old house in the cul-de-sac, already sold, already carrying too much darkness, but to her own home. The first time Lily met Maya, Sarah's 7-year-old daughter, was a moment that broke everyone in the room. Maya came bursting outside with the exact same wild energy, the exact same messy brown curls Lily had once had at that age. Lily sank to her knees in the grass, weeping, wrapping her arms around a niece who felt, in some strange and painful way, like meeting her own stolen childhood face to face. Sarah became her sister's anchor through everything that followed. They spent long hours together sifting through old photo albums, and Sarah told her everything about their father, Thomas, how deeply he had loved her, how he had spent weeks searching those cold woods himself, how he had died still waiting for her to come walking around that corner. Grieving a father she'd been forced to forget was agonizing, but it was also, in its own way, healing, because it meant she was finally, undeniably real again. The most emotional moment of all came 3 weeks after the rescue, when Sarah drove Lily to the care facility to see their mother. Martha's dementia had progressed severely by then. She spent most days seated by the window, gazing out at gardens, lost somewhere in the fog of her own fading mind. Sarah walked in first, holding Lily's hand tightly. Martha turned her head slowly, offering the faint, polite smile of someone recognizing a friendly presence without quite placing the name. And then her gaze drifted past Sarah, toward the woman standing nervously near the doorway. The messy curls, The soft brown eyes, the face that mirrored her own past so precisely. The room went silent, and then something shifted. Some deep maternal instinct, buried beneath disease and decades of grief, flared suddenly, impossibly back to life. Martha raised a shaking, fragile finger, pointing directly at Lily. "You wore your yellow raincoat," she whispered, her voice cracking with clarity that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her illness. "I told you to come straight home." Lily let out a broken sob and crossed the room in seconds, sinking to her knees beside her mother's chair, burying her face in her lap. Martha didn't ask where she'd been. She didn't ask how her little girl had become a grown woman. She simply rested her frail hands on Lily's curls, stroking them exactly the way she had at the breakfast table 27 years earlier. "You're home now, sweetie," she murmured, staring out the garden, tears gathering in her clouded eyes. "My little star Mark is finally home." Sarah stood in the corner of that room, crying silently, watching her broken family become whole again in a way she had never once let herself believe was possible. The story of Lily Miller is a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always lurk in dark alleys or hide behind the face of a stranger. Sometimes it wears a Letterman jacket and walks the halls of the local high school. Sometimes it speaks in a calm, polite voice on the other end of the telephone line, hiding behind an ordinary name and an ordinary life, exploiting nothing more than the quiet trust of a community that never thought to look twice. But this is also, in its own way, a story about the astonishing, stubborn power of the truth, and about a sister's love that refused, across 27 years of silence and grief, to stay buried. A secret, no matter how carefully guarded, no matter how many years pass beneath it, can never truly disappear. Sometimes it only takes one forgotten envelope in a dusty attic, one tiny crescent moon birthmark caught by accident in an old photograph. Mark Vance believed, for 27 years, that he had successfully rewritten history and erased a life without consequence. He underestimated the quiet, unyielding patience of the truth, and he underestimated the fierce, unbreakable love of an older sister who simply refused, against every discouraging year that passed, to let her sister's story stay lost. Lily Miller lost 27 years, her childhood, her father, her name, her sense of who she was ever allowed to be. But in the end, she survived. She reclaimed her name. She reclaimed her family. And sitting in a garden beside her sister and her young niece, watching the sun finally set over the quiet town she was stolen from, she knew at last exactly who she was, and she knew she would never be lost again.